So, I know we got a prequel for this on the way, but I'm also looking forward to the sequel. Why? What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a newer horror release, X. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like horror reviews on a near-daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about X. This focuses on a group of actors who set out to make an adult film in rural Texas under the noses of their reclusive hosts. But when the elderly couple catches their young guests in the act, the cast find themselves in a desperate fight for their lives. This is written and directed by Ty West, best known for horror films like House of the Devil and The Sacrament, and it's actually his first film in 6 years and his first horror film in nearly a decade, as his previous film was the dark comedy western In a Valley of Violence, which, while not a genre he's known for, I still highly recommend. And this was distributed via A24 in a theatrical release. Now, while I always make sure to mention some things in a A24 movie whenever I review it, it's especially keen to take note of that here, as their films tend to not always be the most accessible ones out there. While they're arguably one of the biggest studios, if not the biggest studio for independent filmmaking, especially horror movies, their films aren't always known for having the broadest appeal. Obviously, that's not the case with every single one of their movies, especially as some have been nominated or won Academy Awards, in particular Moonlight winning Best Picture, but it's not often you hear general audiences come out of an A24 movie and it's borderline unanimous that everyone loved it. Even if there's a movie that's hyped up ahead of its release, very rarely does that also translate to everyone who was excited for it winding up loving the film. So consider me surprised when I saw this was one of the films that seemed to be the exception to that rule, especially a film by Ty West, whose work can be a little polarizing in general. Like, I haven't seen every single one of his films, but from what I have seen, I haven't necessarily loved every single one of them, even if I like the style. And his films definitely don't have a mainstream approach to them. But with this one, almost everyone I know who saw it loved it, and was hyping it up as one of the best horror movies of the year so far. Now, even when I'm looking forward to a movie, like I was this, I try to temper my expectations and not let myself get too hyped up unless it's for something I feel there's just no way it can go wrong. Even when I hear that something's supposedly one of the best movies of the year, it gives me more confidence in the film, but I don't go in with this new expectation that I'll immediately think that as well, because then that just leads to disappointment. And I'm glad I tempered my expectations with this film, as, I'm not gonna lie, I thought this was just fine. It's one that I definitely respect, and I appreciate the style here, and I had a good enough time with it. But to be honest, I wouldn't call this one of the best horror movies of the year, or even one of Ty West's absolute best. Like I said, I know a lot of that was immediately being said opening weekend, and if you love this movie, I'm happy for you, but to be honest, I didn't quite enjoy this as much as everyone else. Though, to be clear, I still thought it was good, so don't get me wrong there. I do have some criticisms of it that we're definitely going to get into, but even with those, I would still say the good outweighed the bad. So, we'll start off with the positives. For one thing, there's no denying the sense of style on display, which is something that's been pretty consistent with Ty West's work, at least the films I've seen. If you've especially seen House of the Devil, you'll see there his tributes to 80s horror in the way the overall aesthetic replicates that style. And here, this season paid tribute to slasher films of the 70s. The big film this has been especially compared to is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's set in the same state, it has a grainy feel to it, it's shot on 60mm film, and there's a very grimy atmosphere to it. And I certainly appreciate West replicating that style. I've said this in other reviews before. I love films that pay tribute to a classic style of filmmaking or are a tribute to the art of film itself. And especially as a big horror fan, and a big fan of films from the 70s in particular, I appreciated that a lot about this. I'm not exactly one of the biggest Texas Chainsaw Massacre fans, like it's not one of my favorite horror movies of all time or anything, and if you don't believe me, I just did a whole review series on the franchise, so go check that out. But at the very least, I liked West's recreation of that same grimy feel we saw on display with that. So there's a great mood set within this film, giving it a pretty creepy vibe, especially once we get introduced to the two older characters, Pearl and Howard, who own the property where the adult film is getting made, though without their knowledge, at least at first. I loved a lot of the shot compositions all throughout this. There'd be several instances where West would give attention to detail with things going on in both the foreground and the background to create this sense of dread. There's especially one sequence involving an alligator early on that was shot so well, though I won't reveal specifics as far as how it went, but even though you kind of know where West was going with it and what he was setting up with it, because of just how well crafted the sequence was, you can't help but be impressed. And from an acting standpoint, everyone was pretty solid. Mia Goth is absolutely fantastic here, as easily our most compelling and developed of all these characters, and she actually plays two roles, both as our lead, Maxine, as well as Pearl, in some great heavy makeup, which was another great aspect of the film, by the way. The makeup here was top-notch. Plus, you have Jenna Ortega, who's been on quite a roll as of late, with this being the fourth film she's appeared in 2022, with 3 of those being horror movies. Now, she doesn't get quite as much to do this time around, as she spends the first part of the film staying quiet and to herself, that she's very prudish and she's only tagging along because of her boyfriend, played by Owen Campbell, and she initially doesn't want much to do with the rest of the characters, but she plays a bigger part as things go on, and while it's not a role that's quite as layered as, say, her work in Scream or The Fallout from earlier this year, she manages to make the most out of it. And Owen Campbell himself was also fine, as was Kid Cudi as one of the actors for the movie within the movie, along with Brittany Snow, who provides some comedic relief, in addition to Martin Henderson as the producer of this adult film, and is also Mia Goth's boyfriend. And it's also worth noting that this is definitely much funnier than I was expecting it to be. It's not a flat-out horror comedy, like it's not trying to get a joke in every other minute or so, but it does have a few well-timed bits thrown in there from time to time, which are just enough to break some of the tension. And I found that surprising, but welcome, as I'm always good with movies that use jokes as a way to give the film some balance. I didn't find it to be a jarring tonal shift, and it also gave the film a bit of self-awareness. And it certainly helps offset things, especially once we get to the bloody second half, which is when things really start taking a turn. Now, I will say, I like the motivations of our villains here, who do get something of an arc themselves, because they're both very elderly and they're bitter about their age and they're jealous of these younger characters who they feel almost waste their youth and look down a bit on what they do when they start catching on. But I'm kind of surprised here that there wasn't much of them beyond the fact that, well, they're really old. Like, I was expecting some sort of supernatural force to go along with that, or some wild twist to it, and I want to touch upon that more in a moment, but they're actually just two pretty straightforward, mostly grounded characters with no catch to them, which I almost couldn't believe, especially given some of the things they do here. Some of it does push the suspension of disbelief just a touch here and there, but I at least like they got some sort of depth to them. Now, the level of violence has been a fairly major talking point when it comes to this film, with some really emphasizing how bloody it gets. And while I wouldn't exactly call this any grislier or bloodier or more out there than what we've gotten in any other slasher movie, again, more on that in a moment, I thought that once we got to this part of the film, it was a good enough payoff that will satisfy genre fans who like bloodier horror movies, as it makes for a quick moving second half. However, with all that, I do want to transition into some criticisms I had for this. And again, overall, I think the good outweighed the bad on this, to be clear, but some of the issues I have with it can be very glaring. And the main thing is that while it can be creepy and it can be thrilling, I wouldn't say that was consistently the case. Like, I didn't feel constantly on the edge of my seat with this movie from start to finish, primarily due to its first half. Because for much of the first half, our focus is primarily on our protagonists filming a porno, with only the occasional cutaways to a moment of tension because someone wanders off on their own, or they have a one-off eerie encounter with the older couple. It didn't always quite feel, though, that it was building towards something. Now, we as the audience know that something's eventually going to happen because we know this is a horror movie, and in horror movies, all isn't what it seems to be. But in terms of how the screenplay presents it, this could have fooled you. Like, if you were to walk into this completely blind, not knowing it was a horror movie or not knowing anything about it, you wouldn't have the best idea of where this was going. because there were times I wasn't sure where this film was going, and not like in an interesting way. To me, it felt a little aimless at times, especially since we spend so much time focused on just these meandering scenes of the porno being shot that will go on for way longer than they needed to. Or there's also one instance where we'll get this one extended sequence of the characters lounging around and singing Landslide, and it plays parallel to footage of Howard and Pearl in a split screen, and that was a scene that was well done in terms of its style, but it offered next to nothing. But it goes on as we literally hear the entire song play out. And while I appreciate trying to spend time with the characters so they don't feel so utterly disposable once we get into the slasher part of things, I'm not sure we needed the setup to go on for as long as it did here. Even at an hour and 40 minutes, I was feeling that runtime of it. We got a clear sense of everyone's personalities at the beginning, and considering the direction the film takes most of them, there wasn't much more that was added to them. We instead just got these repetitive scenes that only occasionally built up the tension and otherwise just hit the same few beats a number of times with them, with the only exceptions being Mia Goth and Jenna Ortega. And while it's clever to have this setup of our protagonist shooting an adult film, considering how having sex is viewed as one of the big no-nos in the horror movie rules, and here it's taken to the extreme, I just don't think the film needed to dedicate so much time to these sequences that added literally nothing and yet went on for what felt like forever. I mean, I get stuff like this is a staple of horror films, but when they go on for as long as they do here and they just don't add anything to the story or the characters, I just didn't see the point. I think you could have cut 20 minutes or so from that first half and it would have been a major improvement, as it would have really tightened the pacing. And once we got to that second half where the film goes full-on slasher, it was entertaining, don't get me wrong there. I still liked this part of the film considerably more than the first half, and it has enough of those bloodier moments that I mentioned earlier. They were fun. But as I said earlier, this is really no bloodier or more out there than we've gotten in other slasher movies. Like, I'd still say the Saw movies were 10 times grislier than this. Like, not that I'd call this tame, but I've seen plenty of other films go to much further extremes than this did. Especially since here, a lot of the slasher elements aren't until the last 40 minutes or so. It's not like this goes all out from the very beginning and it just gets worse and worse and bloodier from there. And when I say all this, I speak from a sense of almost bewilderment, as I couldn't quite understand what everyone was saying when they mentioned how shocking and ridiculously violent this movie was. Because that was a huge talking point when people were praising this. But at the end of the day, I felt it's really nothing more than a pretty standard slasher. A fun enough slasher, don't get me wrong there, and one that has a cool visual style to it, and one that I respect and liked enough. And again, to be clear, if you love this movie, I'm glad you did. Like, I'm not here to try taking that away from you. But in terms of structure, I mean, I just didn't see this as doing anything too innovative or groundbreaking. Not that a movie needs to be any of those things in order to be really enjoyable, but that's what others were saying, and I felt that what I was seeing was not lining up with what others were saying about this. And maybe if I didn't hear so much hype ahead of time and walked in blind, maybe I would feel totally different about this, and maybe I would also love this. But as it stands, I thought it was enjoyable. I had a good enough time with it, but I wouldn't say it's anything that blew me away, to be honest. X overall was a good entry in A24's filmography, even if I wouldn't call it another new classic of theirs. The film has solid acting, it has a great sense of style as it pays homage to older horror films, and it has some fun enough bloody thrills in its second half that slasher fans will enjoy. However, the film also suffers from some serious pacing issues in its first half, with an inconsistency in the way it approached building tension and making us spend all this time with several characters despite adding literally nothing to most of their arcs. And even when it went all in on its slasher elements, while those moments were mostly fun, I also wouldn't call it anything too out there, outside of a few select moments, and I think part of why they were so enjoyable was more due to Ty West's filmmaking style rather than because of what was specifically being done. Was it still enjoyable enough? Absolutely. Do I respect it? Most definitely. Am I glad we're getting a mainstream original horror movie? Of course. But while I like the film, and I look forward to seeing where the prequel to this goes, as well as just seeing more from Ty West, this is just nothing that I overall loved. X gets a 7 out of 10. See, still a positive rating despite all my criticisms, in case you were worried there. Like I said, while I'm not going to call it one of the best horror movies of the year or anything, I do respect it. But Let me know, did you see X, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this one of your new favorite A24 films? Is it one of your new favorite horror movies? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.